about a trading situation for New Zealand that is unimaginably better than, frankly, the political hell that we've been through in the last 40 years. This is absolutely transforming the prospects for New Zealand and New Zealand agriculture in particular over the next 2 to 3 decades. And the distinction is so sharp. I remember after I'd set off for Geneva in the mid-1980s, Brian Chamberlain was then the president, and I always argue that the only useful instruction I ever got was not from the bloody government, but from Brian. Because Brian said to me, I had lunch just before I went away, and he said, well, Tim, we've got nothing now. He used rather more agricultural language than that, you can imagine. We've got nothing now, so anything you can get's got to be an improvement. Well, I think I've talked to Brian for a year or two, but I'm very, very sure that Brian would be with me in saying that what we thought we were facing 25 years ago is now gone. And we have a far, far better future than either Brian or I could have imagined. And now the task in front of us, or the generation to follow us, is now to make good use of those opportunities. And that's the next point I want to address, because it's really about supply chains. And it's very complicated. Very complicated. You see, if you go back, when I was born in 1950, 90% of New Zealand exports went to the UK. Not agriculture, 90% of all New Zealand exports went to the one market, the UK. Then we were called Britain's offshore farm. And as you all know, our ancestors or forebears got this idea of globalization better than anyone else. They used this revolutionary new technology called refrigeration, and they developed this country. As a consequence of that, New Zealand became the richest or the second richest country in the world. In other words, our forebears understood how to use globalization 100 years ago and rose to the challenge. They fashioned a few very simple supply chains. They had a huge advantage over us. They deeply understood the customer, because the Europeans amongst them had come from Great Britain. They understood their customer. So they were able to fashion some very simple but highly effective supply chains to deliver essentially the British housewife what she wanted. That was a formula for success. And that was then the world's greatest power, the United Kingdom. Okay, what has happened is that we have shifting our focus now. Instead of being a food basket for Britain, we are now a food basket for Asia. That's the future. Not to forget the European past, particularly for sheep meats, which will still remain hugely important. I've spent 11 years of my life in Switzerland on these issues. I will never forget the importance of Europe. But the growth is major. There's no doubt about that. But do we understand our new customers? I think if we're honest, we have to say we're just in the learning stages. And so I think there's a big challenge there. It's not a trade negotiator's problem. It's a commercial management and science problem. We have to understand these people better. Another thing Don and I were talking in the car about, involving his work with the Asian New Zealand Foundation, some work that Don and the foundation are involved in. I used to run that foundation 8 or 9 years ago for a 2-year period. This is the future challenge for us, to develop the supply chains to align to our new customer base. Now, New Zealand's point of differentiation is obviously quality, food safety, and cost. But are we still the lowest cost producer? Well, it's less clear. If we're looking at dairy, for example, in the strategy that New Zealand Dairy put out about 3 or 4 months ago, the Prime Minister launched it. In their publication, it said, and I quote, in 2003, New Zealand could claim to be amongst the lowest cost dairy producing nations in the world. There is now evidence that New Zealand dairy farmers no longer have a cost competitive advantage, unquote. Now, don't panic before we slash our wrists or move to Uruguay. let's just reflect on this simple but important economic fact. International trade in anything, whether it's agriculture, microphones, computers, whatever, is never the product or the ownership of the lowest cost producer. If it were, then all production would simply move to whoever was the lowest cost producer. So it's economically ignorant to think that that is the only determinant of your market position. Now, we have to be careful about cost, quite clearly, but we have to be even more careful about maintaining our extraordinary productivity growth rate, because at the end of the day, to look at just cost without looking at corresponding productivity is to look at only one side of the equation. The second thing that I'd say on that issue is that our brand is clearly quality. This is our point of differentiation. And now I want to go into the second part of or the last part of my theme, which is a complex mix of quite challenging issues facing New Zealand and New Zealand agriculture around things like climate change, the environment, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to sum this up by using a phrase that the customer is now the new regulator for New Zealand. Now, food miles was the first concrete reminder that in this new world that we live in, we might face trade barriers that were not imposed traditionally, as they have been against New Zealand by governments, but by our customers. But not literally so much by our customers, but rather by those companies like Tesco and Walmart, who are the interface between us and our customers. Now let me again quote you from Dairy New Zealand so that you realise it's not just me from government thinking like this, it's also your own industry. Quote, "The control over market access is arguably shifting from agreements between nation states to agreements between producers and retailers. Global retailers are incredibly powerful in the market because they control what products reach consumers in practically all developed nations. This is both an opportunity and a risk for New Zealand," unquote. Again from their long-term strategy 2009-2010. So, you know, we've just solved, I'm arguing, one problem, which is access to markets in terms of government-imposed problems. I'm going to solve it. We've made massive progress, and I think there's still more progress we're going to make. But are we now facing a different challenge? The answer is, I absolutely think we are. But I'm not convinced that we're not up to it. I think we are up to it. Start with the world's largest company, Walmart. Every hour of every day, Americans spend US $36 million an hour in Walmart stores. Now, Walmart is putting in place what they call a sustainability index. It's based on a complex matrix containing key supply chain processes and their factors and impacts on natural resources, something called people in the community, and energy and climate change. Second example. A few months ago, a British supermarket chain called Waitrose banned a series of fish products which they deemed unilaterally to be not sustainable. And they defined this in terms largely of what they called unacceptable fishing practices, which included, unfortunately for New Zealand hoki, bottom trawling. So they banned all suppliers using bottom trawling, including New Zealand hoki, and they banned a whole lot of other products. In fact, they couldn't find alternative sustainable sources for some fish species. So what happened to them? Did they suffer the consequences of this? Well, on the contrary, within a few months, their share of the British fresh fish market increased from 4% to 10%. Just reflect on that.